right, folks. Well, welcome. It's my pleasure to welcome you here to this session tonight, today, depending on where you're logging in from. I want to welcome our panel of authors and editors of this new collection in bioethics published earlier this year with Bloomsbury Press that's called Bioethical Responsibility in 21st Century Crises. Really want to thank those of you who are joining us and are part of the conversation we'll have here about the new roles and needs for bioethics to engage with very present crises, healthcare, and environment that we are facing. So I am Elizabeth Lanfear. I'll be moderating the conversation today and saying a few opening remarks just to kind of contextualize the conversation as well as introduce our panelists. So I am a faculty member in the Ethics Center at Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center, and I'm affiliated with the departments of both pediatrics and philosophy at the University of Cincinnati. I want to really thank the Center for Public Engagement with Science, also known as PEWS, at the University of Cincinnati for hosting this event tonight or today, depending again where you're calling from. The Center for Public Engagement with Science works to expand and enrich the interface between science and the public to benefit all stakeholders. Their mission is to increase engagement with science by connecting the university to community partners and the public, improve the quality of science engagement by promoting dialogue among and benefit for all stakeholders, and innovate new forms of science engagement by drawing on philosophy and other humanities, natural and social sciences, and science education. They do this through university courses and internships, public-facing events and activities like this one, and engagement with practitioners working at the interface between science and the community. And I think they're a great home for hosting this conversation today. I want to especially recognize and thank Kate Nicole Hoffman and Max Cormandy for their work behind the scenes to make this event happen. This conversation will be recorded and posted to the PEWS YouTube page. Some people are no doubt hearing me say that while watching it on that very page in the future from right now. So in this conversation, I'm joined by my co-editor, Larry Churchill. And Larry is an emeritus professor at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. I'm also joined by 4 authors from the collection. And the book really includes a rich interdisciplinary group of authors from a variety of backgrounds. All of us today happen to be philosophers, so that's kind of fun for this conversation. So I'm going to just introduce the panelists at the front end and then tell you a little bit more about how things are going to go in the conversation. Jonathan Flowers is an assistant professor of philosophy at California State University, Northridge, whose research areas include African-American intellectual history, Japanese aesthetics, American pragmatism, philosophy of disability, and philosophy of technology. Takunda Matose is a research assistant professor and research ethicist at Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center and the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine, who focuses his research on healthcare justice, health inequalities, and research ethics. Lisa Parker is the Dickey, McCamey, and Chilcote Professor of Bioethics at the University of Pittsburgh, where she's a faculty member in the Department of Human Genetics in the School of Public Health, as well as the Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies program in the Arts and Sciences. And she directs the university's Master of Arts in Bioethics program as well. Her scholarship focuses on ethical concerns related to the design and conduct of research, particularly genetic and mental health research, genetic enhancement, and precision medicine. And Travis Reeder is a faculty member in the Johns Hopkins Berman Institute of Bioethics, where he splits his time between teaching at the graduate and undergraduate level, research, and communicating with the public. His research addresses the ethical and policy issues raised by pain medicine, opioids, other drugs, addiction, and North America's drug overdose crisis, and on the overarching theme of catastrophe, which is apt for our conversation tonight, and how to engage in ethical reasoning about our own individual lives in a time dominated by massive structural threats that are too big and too complex for any one of us to meaningfully address on our own. So again, I think all of these authors have really great things to contribute to our conversation, and I'm looking forward to it. Let me tell you briefly about the book to which they all contributed. So the book Bioethical Responsibilities in 21st Century Crises is a collection of essays that when taken as a whole, argues for an expanded role and scope for the field of bioethics to tackle the pressing challenges confronting health and healthcare, challenges to and for individuals, communities, and institutions, as well as the planet that we inhabit, now and on the horizon. So Larry and I approached the collection noting the way the field has changed over the past 50 years, the field of bioethics, and the importance of continued change, right? Not only to sort of meet new biomedical technologies and healthcare delivery systems, but really new ways of understanding the interconnection of health and healthcare with planetary health and climate change, with social policies and practices, with political and financial systems like capitalism and democracy. While each of the chapters in the book takes up how to move bioethics forward this century, we invited these authors here today to talk about what bioethics can and should do right now, in this moment that looks, frankly, quite different from the one in which these chapters were initially written, in some ways that were anticipated and in some ways that may have exceeded any of our expectations or imaginations. The book is embedded in the particularities of North American and often US specific history, healthcare delivery, and political systems. And so I want to acknowledge that going into the conversation, given the ways in which the US is perhaps playing an outsized role in our global ecological and political environments as well. That's going to probably be on display in this discussion. But in bringing this group together in conversation, our goal is really to consider how, as individuals and communities, we might think about our own actions and next steps in confronting bioethical crises that we're facing. So with that sort of background and contextualization, I'm going to put a question to each of our panelists. And I'll say just a few things about their chapter, trying to briefly characterize it as I do, but we'll invite them to say more as well. And then we will have a kind of conversation between the group and welcome your questions that you can put into the chat and we will field. Okay, Lisa, I want to start with you and your chapter. So the chapter also kicks off the book, and in it you talk about how bioethics has contributed to deliberative democratic processes, including reasoned argument through information sharing and debate. However, you pivot in your chapter to asking what you say is the real question, and I quote, of whether reasoned argument still matters. You approach this question, which you want to answer in the affirmative, I think, right, by focusing on two underappreciated phenomena. So one is the role of feelings and emotions in health-relevant discussions, but I'm going to take it that you might also say that's true of deliberation more broadly. And the other is the role of time and the need to take what you call a longer view or a longer time horizon for understanding. I'm really wondering in this moment when it seems like we're constantly being updated with new and changing information, and that might be about biomedical advances, but it also might be about political decisions and political change. How can we embrace both feelings and time in confronting rapidly evolving problems confronting us?
Well, thank you. And thanks for putting this together and for everyone being here. I mean, I think that my answer about why reason still matters is basically to say because we don't have any good alternative. And the reality as well is that what you're talking about in terms of attending to feelings and taking time, I think is a necessity for individuals and for society and for bioethics as a field of inquiry, and for whatever reasoned arguments we want to try to make or what research we want to pursue, that we need to take time and take feelings into account. So thinking about this question a bit in advance, and honestly listening to what was it, Science News Today within the past week or so, there was a discussion about how the human brain, or in the human brain, the music of the brain, it was a wonderful image, that the prefrontal cortex is the composer, that it takes the melody of memory, the rhythms of emotion, the harmonies of sensation, and organizes it into thought, makes it coherent. that that the prefrontal cortex operates as the seat of self-control, as the architect of intention. And in a way, I think that's what we can try to do in our arguments, is operate in that way, but need to take in the sensations, the environmental context, the rhythms of emotion, and then integrate those emotions into decision making as our ventromedial cortex does. You engage in weighing of risks and potential benefits in our arguments, as in our brains we do in another part of the cortex. So sort of our arguments, I think, mirror our neuroscience in a way of needing to take this into account. And then you point to, well, but wait, our brains are having troubles these days with all of the notifications and but wait, look at your phone. No, wait, look at your phone. No, really look at it again. And again, heightened emotion and polarized positions that distract from the kind of deep focus that our brains need, and that I think our arguments and our research needs. And I think our field, like other fields in academia, are set up with reward structures that invite us to attend here and get the quick fix of going to another meeting. We have a point system for how many meetings you attend, and of course how many articles you publish and so on, the quantifiability of all of this, as opposed to how deeply did you think about this and for how long, and how good is your analysis really. And I think it's at that deeper level of focusing that we can find patterns, we can find reasoning by analogy, we can find common ground to bring together within our arguments, in our own minds, but also as we're arguing with, presenting reasoned arguments to people, we can bring people together to find some common ground. I think of, well, the chapter that you co-authored, you and Takunda, where you point out that, look, there's a common ground between those who are incarcerated and the correctional staff who work with them. And from my perspective of being concerned about healthcare and finding shared interests, both have interests in high quality mental health care. Absolutely, right? It keeps everyone safer. That both groups who have probably rather different emotional stances, if you will, at much of the time, nevertheless can find common ground in the desirability of having multiple bases of self-respect and of regard, not just power over somebody else, but also education, finding some beauty, finding some relationship with others. Everybody benefits from that. But you have to stop and think about it for a while and not be reacting kind of knee-jerk emotionally to find that. And I hope that reasoned argument can help to bring that to finding that common ground. And then finally, I'm pleased that we're going to be talking, with Travis about the idea of having reasons to do something, replacing a duty to do something. And what does that mean about then thinking about competing reasons, finding recognizing that a competing reason can be how it makes me feel to do something. And that then goes back to my chapter of some feelings are just so essential to our well-being. Some feelings really tap into that fight or flight, safety, amygdala response of, am I okay? And so that if these identity forming reasons, these identity forming feelings get attached to reasons for doing something, like, classic example these days is, do I vaccinate my child or not? Well, if I do I fall out of the community that I've come to be a part of? Am I no longer a mom who can be with this group for coffee, or in this church for spiritual life? And how does that then function in this economy of reasons that, in a different context, Travis, I think you're talking about, of a reason to do something? And so I look forward to this discussion because I think there are a lot of commonalities.
Thanks so much, Lisa. As you were talking, I was thinking, and maybe I spend too much time on certain parts of the internet, but sort of this internet meme of, your feelings aren't facts, right? Like this is kind of a clapback. And I think it's, kind of this interesting, like, yes, where people are maybe kind of reasoning from or reacting from this emotive place, but also I think you're bringing out the role of emotions in indicating judgments and evaluative and moral judgments, right? There's a rich literature there of moral emotions and thinking about the ways in which feelings are part of how we construe what is a risk and what is a benefit when we're talking about things in maybe medical decision making, but also long-term decision making, and what we feel or the attachments we might feel to our planet and wanting to see it thrive and survive for future generations. And so I think there's a conversation we can continue to have here tonight about this. You also said something that I thought was striking around kind of naming the reward systems in academia and bioethics, and sort of maybe the things that are going to solve the crises are not the things that align with promotion metrics, right, for folks. And I think this actually feeds really nicely into Jonathan's an aspect of Jonathan's chapter. So, Jonathan, your chapter brings out two insights that are really especially useful for this conversation. And one is you point to citational practices, right, or these norms of inheritance and reproduction. This is my language characterizing it. Be curious if that's tracks with yours, but right, of sort of the key, who's identified as the key figures or thoughts that shape a field. For in this case, right, bioethics, how scholars are then also expected to situate ourselves within and among those key figures. Like we put ourselves into conversation with a certain existing conversation, and there's this lineage there, right? And I think as you point out, and I think this is right, the system of citational norms, what you call citational tyranny, is a way of shaping and reinforcing authority, but it also circumscribes who isn't granted authority, right? Like it's keeping people in and it's keeping people out. And this mirrors other systems and structures of oppression and exclusion around marginalized identities most often, right? Whether it's race, gender, disability. And you point out how scholarship that doesn't subscribe to dominant norms, or that is, for example, about Black experience or disabled experience, is labeled as not bioethics, or it's characterized as activism, contra, right, academic contribution. And we're currently living amidst arguably an authoritarian approach to science and healthcare, in which working on or teaching many topics in bioethics is also itself being painted as advocacy or activism rather than scholarship. Words and identities are being erased from research grants, from classroom teaching. I'm going to kind of quote a couple of those words as they've been reported from government memos in the media. They include things like biases, Black, discrimination, diversity, disability, equity, female, gender, Hispanic, LGBT, marginalized, minority, race, sex, social justice, women. So I guess I'm wondering, in light, kind of extending parts of your chapter, if you have thoughts about how we can and should navigate this tyrannical erasure in academia, health, and sciences that we are experiencing.
So I've been thinking about how to answer this question for some time, because I'm quite often asked how we navigate these sort of structures of oppression, particularly as they manifest in academia. And when people ask me how we navigate these structures, typically I hear it as, how do we resolve them, or how do we get out of them, or how do we continue to do our work under conditions of oppression? And I believe, following Sarah Ahmed, who I cite extensively in the chapter, I think this is the wrong question to ask, right? So Ahmed, in Phenomenology of Whiteness, says that a an uncritical focus on solving the problem or resolving the issue rather than diving into it tends to result in a misunderstanding or a partial understanding of the situation in the context of oppression that we are grappling with. And so she warns against the very easy move to we are now suddenly confronted with this massive oppressive system, or we are suddenly made aware of the fact that we are now targets of said system. So what do we do about it? And so to go back to the question, right? My response is, before we can learn to navigate what you're rightfully describing as tyrannical erasure in academia, health, and sciences, we have to understand the ways in which academia, health, and sciences are complicit in creating the context under which we now struggle. And so to tie this to my chapter, it is not an accident that the very kind or the very non-normative strands of bioethics that were often labeled as activism, because the analysis and the bioethical engagement tended towards pointing out structural issues that gave rise to disparate health outcomes, structural issues that resulted in, say, the persistence of racist, sexist, queerphobic myths about the health and bodies of marginalized persons, and a variety of forms of epistemic erasure, right? The very structures of bioethics that positioned these non-normative forms of bioethical inquiry are some of the same structures that are now being leveraged to maintain these structures of oppression. And so to provide an example, right, if we take the assumption of a normative body, if we take the assumption of a normative body and trace its development in and through eugenics and white supremacy, it is no accident that the erasure of the broad sort of adjectival markers of identities from academia, health, and the sciences coincides with the reinstantiation of a default sort of normative body. This is the norm. Everything else is a deviation from it. And if you profess to engage in critical inquiry into the bioethical conditions of these deviant subjects, you are no longer engaging in valuable research, right? And so one of the things that I take from this question is, if we're ever going to navigate this tyrannical erasure, we have to understand the ways in which our own disciplinary and academic norms provided some of the groundwork for the very tools of suppression that are now being imposed upon us. And beyond that, one of the ways that we might navigate this sort of erasure is by looking at the ways in which we ourselves may have been complicit in erasures within our own intellectual communities. That is to say, what are the lessons that we suppressed? What are the knowledges that we treated as less than that are now suddenly incredibly valuable in this moment? And so we can, a good example of this is looking at the ways in which bioethics in the early 90s all the way up through the mid-aughts tended to treat disabled subject positions as less credible about their own experiences of disability, their own life opportunities, their own life satisfaction. If you look at this rhetorically, you can see a parallel between the ways in which bioethics engaged with disabled subject positions and the ways in which the medical establishment engaged with folks who spoke out about long COVID. And indeed, a lot of the ways in which some of the cognitive effects of long COVID have been treated have been drawn from treatments of disability. So it's disabled knowledge that is enabling folks who were previously able-bodied to persist in their interactions with the world, which has led not necessarily to a reevaluation of disabled knowledge, but a recognition that disabled subject positions might have something, however marginal, to contribute to a broader conversation. And so in order to navigate, again, this tyrannical erasure in academia, we need to look inwards to the ways in which our own, reproduction of citational tyranny, our own demand that scholarship be reproduced in a particular image, that scholars themselves be organized in a particular way, has enabled many of the conditions that we are now sort of protesting against. And so that, while that is not a comprehensive answer to how we navigate the situation as it is, I do think that provides a starting point for ways that we might, as I say in the chapter, cite differently or cite against the grain. So we, in understanding the ways that our field has contributed to this widening context of oppression, we then must learn to cite differently, not to repeat the same kind of regulatory norms that have structured the field thus far.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And I think, right, I think you're right that we need to look inward as a field. And this is, I think, part of why something I think that work in all of the chapters in the book is really to ask, well, where are the shortcomings of bioethics in terms of meeting the moment, and maybe where have the historical shortcomings been? And I think we can have in time tonight, we can have a conversation about sort of what are potentially creative ways. And I'm thinking about the ways in which this group of people speaking are at different career stages and institutional positions, and how you kind of create new norms as a field, recognizing that your peer reviewers have a set of expectations they impose on you, and your mentors and your deans, and everyone's sort of brought up in these traditions, and that we might also want to critique and challenge and maybe revolutionize in all sorts of ways. So hopefully let's try to get there. But I think thinking along these lines of how to think differently around bioethics, maybe shortcomings or incompleteness, if not outright avoidance of certain things. I want to turn to Kunda, the chapter you and I wrote together, because I think we in that chapter invite the field of bioethics to think differently about incarceration and incarcerated folks interacting with health and with bioethics. We're looking specifically in the chapter at the problem of mass incarceration in the United States, inviting new ways into it. And, we note in the chapter that bioethics has previously had kind of a narrow view of incarcerated folks, right? It's a problem of how to interact with incarcerated people as research subjects, maybe how to interact with the incarcerated patient who comes from a carceral facility to receive medical care in a hospital. And we draw, some of the thinkers that I think Jonathan in his chapter also notes have been left out of bioethics scholarship to try to engage specifically. And, we just to kind of say, we also have both written and contributed to the scholarship in collaboration with incarcerated or formerly incarcerated folks, and really trying to do that work of partnering with people who have direct experience of incarceration. So I invite you to say more about that, but also to think about it in terms of sort of ongoing problems in the US with mass incarceration, but also the fact that the US is interacting also in new ways with it, well, maybe in some of the old ways, in a just more robust volume, with people who are being detained and contained by immigration and border officials, not necessarily anywhere near US borders, so really across the United States. And we're facing questions, right, of how hospitals can and should interact with law enforcement or immigration officials, patients potentially being in immigration official custody or being sought by immigration officials. We're facing outbreaks of communicable diseases in detention facilities, questions of oversight for facilities incarcerating both adults and children. I don't know, are you seeing opportunities for bioethical intervention amidst these urgent issues? Or maybe is this more of a, yeah, bioethics should have been, is already complicit in some of the problems and we're turning our attention to it too late? Are there new ways of thinking that would be productive in this moment for us to engage as bioethicists?
That was a lot. And I think actually there are many questions there. I think it's very fascinating. So I was looking back at some of our work. You know, we wrote that initial paper, with our colleague at Reach. That was back in, I think it came out 2020, right? We were working on it 2019. So we've been engaging with individuals. So for those of you who are not familiar, we were Elizabeth and I were both in Nashville, where we engaged in a philosophy group with individuals who are on Tennessee's death row. We have had opportunities to not only think critically with them, but also actually try to do some scholarship with them as well. And so it's just interesting for me to think that, as long as we've been doing this, there continue to be, I would say, gaps in terms of the way we're thinking about it. And I guess one thing I'll say is just I want to actually be a little critical of the chapter we wrote, and mainly in kind of like two regards. I think we wanted to focus on incarceration, and there are many good reasons for that. It gives us a nice focus, and I think there's still a lot of issues that are left unattended when it comes to questions of incarceration and its like interaction with bioethics and healthcare in general. But one of the things that if we look at people who care about these kinds of issues, right, they'll often talk about the criminal legal system as a way of sort of expanding that. But I think part of what at least for me, what I've come to realize over the last year and a half, 2 years, right, since we actually wrote this, is that really I think we need to even, in some ways, be even broader, right? So thinking about just the legal system, and this is one of the things that became really apparent over the last year, right? So it's not just people, it's people who were here legally but had immigration status, right? So the Germans call it Migrationshintergrund, right? So the migration backgrounds and how vulnerable those individuals are just in engaging with the legal system. And then also people who, right, are just out in the streets as the kind of immigration enforcement has come into the cities and has come into other places. As we've seen, the notion of safe harbors, right? Hospitals that used to be sort of deemed safe places, schools that used to be sort of exempt from certain kinds of legal action, legal interventions have become a lot more vulnerable. And that's just something we don't actually engage with in this chapter that's only become even more apparent. Not that it's not there, but it's not really emphasized in ways that I think the last the last year and a half of the current administration has made really, really poignant. And so that's something that I think is an invitation for those of us who have thought about these issues, need to continue to engage. And I kind of echo what Jonathan was saying, right? This is yet another opportunity to see if we can actually get into more conversations and bring in more people into thinking together about some of these issues than we have. But I'll just say like one other thing, which I think has, again, I'm going to be a little critical here, but I see this as an opportunity for, in the spirit of our chapter, we're thinking about, okay, what are the next steps? Where should we move our scholarship forward? And I think one of the other points that I've really been wrestling with, since the current administration has come into place is, we focus on this kind of relational lens, right? We are very much influenced by feminist thinkers, and the Black radical tradition, and thinking about solidarity and the role of certain kinds of engagement and community. But one of the things that has really struck me about the last, even pre the election, is the ways in which notions of community and engagement can also be mobilized sort of for harm. And so, again, this is all intersecting when we're thinking about immigration enforcement, but the way also certain, subalterns are being kind of criminalized or at least like intentionally marginalized, and the mobilization of force against certain groups in this moment. And part of that is driven by these notions of finding common ground in ways that are actually very pernicious. And so, again, I think this is just an opportunity for us who care about these things, but for scholars to really engage with those topics.
Thanks, Takunda. And I think you're right to push us in our thinking. And that's part of why we wanted to have this conversation, with recognizing, we wrote these chapters some time ago, and going back to Lisa on time, the long horizon can be helpful. We also get new data and we see how our hypotheses play out in the real world, and rather than kind of the theoretical one that might be working in our head. And I think that is kind of, again, how to have ongoing and updated conversations and think about who needs to be part of those conversations, and including engaging, not just among other scholars, but thinking really broadly with other folks, because we're all part of this bios together, right? And I appreciate you kind of turning to this relational component, and also kind of groups. And I'm hoping that, Travis, you can help us think through a little bit, because I think your work is kind of this interesting, recognizing the role of the individual within a collective, right? And in your recent work is on what you call catastrophe ethics. It's also the title of a book that you published in 2024. And in your chapter in this collection, you're guiding readers through a heuristic for thinking about how to approach our individual roles and responsibilities in the face of collective crises, right? And these communal we need communal involvement, but we have to figure out how to navigate as an individual. And everything we've talked about so far, I think, is a collective problem requiring systems level change, systems level, maybe not solutions. Because now Jonathan has me thinking about trying to be kind of anti-solutions, but really just thinking through evolving, right? And how individuals can contribute to that evolution. So tall order, but can you help us think through how we might approach our individual actions, whether as scholars, activists, or as community members, friends, neighbors, and considering some of these issues that we're talking about here and other bioethical crises?
Yeah, I mean, thanks putting me last and saying, can you fix this, please? No.
Framework, just a framework, not a solution.
That's right. I did really appreciate Takunda, and now I feel like I can't out philosophize the philosopher move of at the book launch speaking event criticizing the work done in the book. Like, we've reached max philosophizing now. But I was thinking something sort of similar, that time is moving so fast that I don't think I even fully appreciated the work that I did in the book Catastrophe Ethics, which fed this chapter, I was doing from 2021 to 2023. Then we worked on this chapter, a year and 2 years ago. And even over that time, I didn't sort of fully appreciate how the problems that I was identifying were we need to think about how to individually respond to these collective threats were just all around us, and just like more and more than we think. And so the background here is philosophers in particular often talk about climate change as this like really unique case of a massive structural threat that makes a lot of us who have sort of environmental tendencies feel like we have a moral responsibility to react in some way, minimize your carbon footprint or whatever, even though your response is so small. So you have this problem of causal inefficacy. And so there's this whole cottage industry, this academic literature, going back at least a couple of decades saying, do we have a duty to do something like minimize our carbon footprint because the problem is so big and we are so we. And one of the moves that I wanted to make in my work is to say, so yeah, that's a big problem for climate change, but also for a lot of things. That argument was actually happening in the animal ethics literature in like the 80s and 90s, because the utilitarians really had to struggle with like, if eating this burger in front of me doesn't cause harm to an animal, like what is my utilitarian sensibility doing to justify my vegetarianism or veganism? And so we had a lot of utilitarian animal rights folks, or animal welfare folks arguing solve this problem, like of what it means to be an individually responsible person against a collective threat. So there's one more case, which is the animals case. And then what I end up thinking about is that like the more I worked in public health ethics and thought about public health crises, the more I just really saw this crop up everywhere. And so anytime that we're facing a real structural threat, our individual contribution ends up feeling pretty swamped. And so my colleague Nabina Liba and I talked about this in the context of racial justice, that very often we get these sorts of moves that, in 2020, in the sort of awakening moment of racial justice that summer, folks were told to like do the thing, join the book club and listen to the right podcast and like, take these individual actions. But the problem is this big structural problem. And so Nabina and I thought about the same sort of issue of like, what is your responsibility as an individual? I thought a lot while I was writing the book about war. At the time, Russia had invaded Ukraine. And then by the time that I was doing follow-up work, there was Israel and Gaza. And as we know, we just sort of kind of keep multiplying cases. But my students constantly during that time were arguing for sort of obligations to withdraw efforts in some way, so boycott sorts of efforts. While Israel is decimating Gaza, what are you doing to put pressure on people who are funding this effort or whatever? And so this is just replicating over and over and over. And then with the current political situation, we could just sort of run down the street screaming constantly with the things that we're being told we ought to be doing in response to one crisis or another. Okay, so that's the problem that I'm dealing with. And I think we do have to recognize that there has to be a triaging effort, right? So the sort of framework that you mentioned that I introduce in the chapter is trying to give something concrete to people who are picking up and looking for a tool. How do I allocate my moral resources, my temporal and financial resources, but like all of it's finite. You can't do everything. And so we need a triage system. We do have to recognize that our individual contributions are tiny. So we shouldn't delude ourselves to thinking that like, well, climate change is too big, but this other systemic threat, like I'm going to be the one who change. Sure, like I said, don't delude yourself. Like sometimes there are sparks, but by and large, most of us just need to be worker bees, right? Like massive systemic change requires lots of change agents. And so your contributions are going to be tiny. We also need to recognize that you largely can't fully extract yourself from many systems of harm and oppression. I talk a lot about the book Against Purity, and Shotwell in this book has this lovely quote that I should have written down so that I could be prepared to give her full credit. But it's something like, we do, recognizing the ways that we're implicated in harms and injustices, we do better to recognize our implications and complicity than trying to pretend like we can always extract ourselves. Like, be honest. So what this all means is that we're just constantly flooded by opportunities to respond to the threats around us. And I think that means that, like, one of the most important points here is, I mentioned quickly earlier, but we should sit with, which is that you cannot do everything. You cannot do everything. And if it were the case that what we had were something like strict moral duties every time some serious harm was happening, and we could be a part of it or not in some very tiny way, that would be a really bad moral formula for us, because we would just be failing in all the moral duties all the time, like innumerable moral duties. Like, as we have this conversation, we're just failing constantly. So Lisa very nicely mentioned that I like to talk about reasons rather than duties. And part of that is because reasons still really matter. They have normative force. But it's not that we're failing in this really terrible way constantly. And so the moral triaging effort is like, how do you respond to an overwhelming number of reasons? So here's the Cliff's Notes. I think that we're overwhelmed for two reasons: because there's always more to do, and what we do is tiny, right? And so what I think we should do is we should look at those two things and be honest about them, and then recognize that what that means is that we all have latitude to sort of carve out a response to just overwhelming catastrophe. Because if you don't recognize latitude, then you think you're just failing in all of these ways. But everybody's failing if that's what's happening. So instead, what we could do is say, what am I good at? What do I have the bandwidth for? What will I not burn out when I'm doing, right? Et cetera, et cetera. And I want to stop talking, so I'll just say quickly one of the things that I've sort of just settled on, because it's also just better to do this ahead of time and make rules for yourself, is I think I have a pretty unique opportunity in my career and my placement, et cetera, to make progress in several public health crises involving drugs, opioids, pain. It's work that gets an audience, and I can go around and do it. But very often I'm asked to like fly places, right? To go talk to doctors. And I'm a climate change ethicist. And so here's the thing I just don't worry about anymore. I don't worry about my carbon footprint when I'm trying to talk to doctors who are addressing addiction and overdose. I can't do both of those at the same time. And so like, I'm gonna triage my efforts in this way, because this is a thing that I think I have a rather unique opportunity to make some headway in. So I will stop there. That's as much as I can offer as a tool.
Larry, you have a response or reaction to that?
Well, I just want to say thank you to all the speakers. And each of them, I think, touched on something that I feel very keenly about, and that is that ethics is always a process of trying to get people to slow down and reflect rather than simply react. And one of the ways that this comes to me is in the Kahneman and Tversky work, in which they say the brain really prefers the quick response. It's metaphoric, it's reactive, it solves the problem. And one of the reasons bioethics has been sort of enticed into this is because we grew up actually in a medical context in which we were asked to respond quickly and to provide a solution so that, the work can go on. The harder part, and you have to make a conscious effort, Kahneman and Tversky say, to do this is to slow down and do a kind of thinking which is more analytical. It's more appreciative of context. It brings into account the need for multiple kind of conversations. So all kinds of things that I think Lisa and also Takunda and also Jonathan and Travis were talking about really depends on nurturing a certain kind of capacity. And I think this is an important kind of skill for the future of bioethics.
Yeah, I appreciate you drawing that out. I think time feels like both where we sort of started the conversation and where we've come to thus far. In recognition of time, I'd love to invite audience who are here to put their questions for the panelists, whether it's for the panel as a whole or directed at individuals, into the chat. I believe you can message us. We will get those. So do invite you to do that as we continue to converse here, because we'd love your interests and where you're drawn toward and what you would like to talk about. I'm just, Travis, on what you said about thinking really, like there's so many ways we can fail, but there's also so many possible ways we could be useful, is I think another way to look at it. So like we could constantly be insufficient, but we could also constantly be trying to find the ways in which we can do something. And I appreciate you kind of pointing to that combination of like, what am I good at? What is not going to burn me out? I've been thinking a lot alongside, feminists and other scholars around like what brings you joy or what brings you pleasure as well, and recognizing like our time is finite. We might as well be trying to have some fun here while we're doing some of these things. So I think there's a lot of kind of ways in to think about how to move forward. One thing that I guess I've been trying to toy with in this conversation is that on the one hand, we're talking about, right, this constant flooding of information. We have to react, as Larry said, like in this biomedical context in which bioethics has largely resided, although it's not exclusively there, we're asked to make these quick decisions, react into things often. I mean, I'm a clinical ethicist, react maybe in the moment to a clinical ethics problem that is brought to you. And yet we need sort of that time and that reflection. And I guess I'm also wondering about, we have, sort of 50 years-ish of bioethics, maybe more now, I guess. And in a sense, there's like a long time horizon of bioethics to look at too. And I wonder, because things that have come up in this conversation are all of these sort of awakening moments that have happened. So things that have been mentioned: the murder of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, the COVID-19 pandemic and long COVID and reacting kind of to an emerging pandemic. And the emergence of intense political polarization, the emergence of an authoritarian immigration regime, and they've all sort of been these like moments that have thwarted us. And I wonder kind of if you have thoughts on how, as a field, we can. I feel like we keep getting caught off guard. And we're reactive in ways. And I mean, I know we're reactive to like new biomedical technologies that emerge suddenly, but there's a lot of sort of reacting. And I wonder what you might say to that. Maybe this is an on the fly assessment. Lisa, what are you going to say about that?
I think we could take a lesson from clinical bioethics, as Larry pointed, that it feels like an emergency all the time. And it seldom is. I mean, sometimes it genuinely is, but usually that's not a bioethics emergency. That's a health emergency. And if there is a bioethics emergency, it was a long time in coming, and it's because nobody came to the bioethicist in a timely manner for analysis. Now, I'm not suggesting that we're going to go off and sit on a mountain and write a tome, but seldom do we really need as fast a reaction as we do. I think similarly, and just to pick up on one of the many events that you pointed to, the murder of George Floyd was a moment, but boy, it was a long time in coming. It's still with us. There is no reason to think that if I didn't react then, that I couldn't still react now in a very thoughtful and differently, but still important and impactful way. And I think to like that, which yes, occurred in a very, very sustained long moment, right? But it was a moment. But to treat it as and only is to do all the meaning it may have and all the effect and impact it may have unfairly. And I think it's to be sucked into those who want speed and who want AI to be moving so quickly that nobody can stop and say, but wait a minute, do we want to be that productive? Who in the world says we want 15 times, 10 times, whatever times productive? Why? Who wants that? I mean, yes, if someone I love is dying of X disease, I want immediate productivity, absolutely. But what I want is not productivity, I want the cure. And as rapidly as possible. But productivity for its own sake, no, not so much. And speed for its own sake, not so much. A roller coaster, yes, but real life, no. And I think we need to begin to say that in our lives and in our analyses.
And I wonder, Lisa, how this goes back to the point you made about kind of the motives and the incentive structures, and whose incentive structures are those, and how are we chasing after them, and how might they want AI to impact our labor and productivity, right? And there's a lot to be said there. Do other panelists have reactions to this kind of this point about time? Yeah, Jonathan.
So, I mean, this point about time is interesting, at least from a phenomenological perspective, because we experience time as going faster or slower depending on the degree of a sort of immersion in the activity in question, right? Our own sort of intentionality towards the activity. And so when everything feels urgent, when everything feels like it's one emergency after another, everything feels faster, right? And so I in thinking about this, I want to take something from both from both John and Larry, or not Travis and Larry, right? So one, in order to triage sort of our responses, as Travis suggests, we actually have to slow down, right? We have to slow down and recognize which among the panoply of emergent situations is the ones that not only can we deal with, but can we deal with in such a way that we can preserve ourselves for dealing with the next emergent situation. And insofar as we recognize what the next emergent situation is, we need to assess whether or not it is, or we can deal with that situation in such a way as to preserve ourselves for the next emergent situation. And this, I think, is, I mean, if we go back to something that I pointed out in my chapter, this is something that we could get from Audre Lorde's understanding of self-care, right? In the Cancer Journal, she presents self-care as not like, spa days, but as the conservation of her limited resources in the face of like the overwhelming threat of cancer, such that she can do all of the work that she is not only asked to do, but called to do without depleting her already limited reserves. And that requires a degree of triage, a degree of slowing down and recognizing which emergent situation we have the capacity to engage with. And generally, as philosophers, at least traditionally trained, we're trained as systemic thinkers. We want large structures to deal with the grand issues, whereas the traditions that I primarily engage with, Japanese philosophy, Africana philosophy, tend to recognize that these larger things are the result of the interactions of much smaller things, right? And in recognizing how the much smaller things come together, we can affect the larger sort of problem.
Elizabeth, It looks like we've got a fair number of things in the chat box and also in the Q&A, and I'm wondering if it's timely to bring
Yeah,
the audience
I
in.
think let's get to Kunda. I know you raised your hand. Connects to some of the chat.
Thank you. Yeah. So I was actually going to try to bring in the Mark's question from the Q&A here, right? Which is, so I don't know if everyone can see it in the audience, right? Right, but it's talking about the value of bioethics, about efforts to bring in, like the environment into bioethics in the 70s and how that may or may not be uh, successful or has not been successful. And, and I guess the way I want to tie this into this conversation is, I think there are a lot of things in the world that often confront us as these emergencies. And one of the things I worry about is the ways in which emergencies tend to be used to justify sort of leaving certain issues aside, or in particular, leaving certain people aside, right? So this is an emergency. So because we have an emergency, we need to, and this is where especially a lot of bioethicists have tended to lean on very utilitarian intuitions, right? So save the most lives. Um, but there are still people, right? Not just bioethicists, but other scholars who are still attending to these other kinds of issues, right? So I was thinking about the environmental factors, right? So thinking about how, for example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, well, it's these issues in the environment that lead to certain kinds of health conditions, which then lead to particular kinds of vulnerabilities during the pandemic that become important. And so, yeah, I agree with Larry's point earlier, right? So what's really incumbent on us is to actually try to weigh both these things, right? How do we do the long-term thinking? How do we continue to reflect on these kind of, you know, long-standing issues, even during times of emergency? And I think this is really important because of a lot of the things, right? So part of what I've written about in the past is necropolitics, right? Like during those moments of emergencies, we start to really see decisions about the way we decide about which lives are most valuable and how are we going to make, these triaging in a different sense than Travis was talking about, right? Like um, really problematic kinds of decisions that are informed by these background notions. But these are things that have been around for a long time. George Floyd was not the first Black man to get killed. There are lots that are less high profile versions. They're right there. And these are kinds of issues that have been going on, but I think that there's still this important role for bioethicists to keep connecting us to these other kinds of questions, to engage in the slow thinking that helps us to reflect that even in a moment of emergency, what are the things that are leading to certain outcomes, certain facets to how the emergency manifests and also plays out. So I think those are really important things to kind of keep in mind. But yeah, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, and I mean, I appreciate this, and I want to touch on two questions in the Q&A, and I think you referenced one of them to Kunda, because I think there's this point made, right, that if we go back to Potter and sort of the environmental bios kind of concept of bioethics, that was certainly on our mind, Larry and my mind, when we were thinking about this collection. There's a whole, I don't know, a third or a half of the book is probably actually tackling environmental problems, not sort of hospital or medical based problems. because I think, right, this is that tradition of bioethics. And so there's this question really just around kind of what specific value does bioethics bring to other fields, which I think is an interesting way to frame it. And I guess I want to maybe put that question together with, I think, this other thing that's come up in the Q&A that was also on my mind in this conversation, which is, it is true, right, that these acute moments shouldn't be an awakening, yet they often have been, at least for the dominant voices in the field, right? Maybe the voices that are kind of, or the kinds of things the field has cared about, and these awakening moments have led to a recognition of a need to pivot or a need to change that probably had scholars and perspectives not been marginalized would not have been the case, right? I think that's part of the issue. And so there's this question about, right, mentioning Jonathan talking about citational erasure, and really, if this hadn't been the history of bioethics, might we have seen things differently and not be kind of caught off guard with these awakening moments, but actually see and maybe, I don't want to say like predict the future because no one's an oracle, but it wouldn't be so, it wouldn't seem like having to quickly react. Jonathan, what do you have to say about that?
And so I want to sort of tackle these two sort of simultaneously, right? And so the question of what bioethics brings to other fields is not one that is often posed to bioethics. Bioethics as a discipline, sort of after it gained its prominence, has been in a position to demand of other fields, what can you give to us? Justify your analysis, your methodology, your epistemology within the standards that we set so that we might determine its value within a space that we have organized. And this is, again, part of the sort of citational tyranny of bioethics, particularly insofar as it proceeds from, again, primarily Western philosophical sort of engagements with the world. And so this gets us to the second half of the question, right? What would this look like if bioethics were say, more inclusive? And again, I mean, my students often ask me similar kinds of questions when I teach medical ethics, when I teach philosophy of disability, and point to the ways in which much philosophy of disability emerged in response to the ways that bioethics did not take seriously disabled subject positions. And so I tend to think of this in the same sort of vein as how do we negotiate the crisis, right? And so in order to answer the question, we'd have to sort of understand what we mean by more inclusive, right? What we mean by more inclusive, because the history of bioethics is not one of inclusion. It's one of a development primarily, at least in my view, out of responses to eugenics and then utilitarian sort of arguments that developed out of animal ethics and then recognized, hey, we have something to say about the development of biotechnology, and we're uniquely positioned to speak about these ethics. Uniquely positioned by whom and in what way? And how does the assumption of one's unique position to speak about particular sort of structural or technological developments that largely are treated as within your subject position a net good, well, whole hosts of folks sort of struggle within those very same technosocial systems. And so if we think about inclusion in this way, right, we have to ask ourselves, right, what do we mean by inclusion? How are these individuals included? Because you could say that marginalized subjects have always been included in bioethics as a contra to the establishment of a normative body, right? Or as an indication of a particular degree of deviance that needs to be accounted for within a given sort of ethical framework, right? That is inclusion. It's pernicious inclusion, but it's inclusion nonetheless. If you mean by inclusion, what would bioethics look like if marginalized subjects were the dominant or within the dominant epistemic position within bioethics? Other questions need to be asked. How did they come to be a dominant epistemic position within bioethics? And in what way is there marginality, again, re-articulated through the regulatory or citational norms of the field such that it is palatable, not just within bioethics, but within bioethics as part of philosophy? Because insofar as this is the case, bioethics is a branch of philosophy. And insofar as bioethics has its own norms, it is still subject to the norms of the broader discipline of philosophy. And this gets to the core of the question. People reflect and think at different rates, partially based on experience and interest. And insofar as there is a privileged mode and speed at which a given professional philosopher should be thinking, and Peter Ralston points this out brilliantly in his Dewey lecture, the folks that we would assume to be included as part of this new bioethics would mostly find themselves marginalized. And at this point, it's when I'm explaining this to my students, I have to remind them, Clarence Thomas is Black, right? And he sits on the Supreme Court. And insofar as that, and if you look at his sort of judicial history, one can come to the position that marginality is no defense from the reproduction of citational tyranny.
Can I just underline everything that Jonathan said? Bioethics risks becoming a ghettoized field to the extent that it sticks with just philosophy or just a certain way of doing philosophy. And bioethics comes into its own and is actually able to make some contributions when it listens carefully to people from public health and anthropology, sociology, and not just listen to them in terms of trying to judge if they're going to say an appropriate thing that we could use, but trying to understand their methods and how they came to the conclusion that they did. So collaborative work is a really important part, I think, of whatever bioethics is going to be in the future, if it's going to be an effective discipline.
So it's interesting because we're all philosophers here, and so I, on the one hand, feel like yes, we're doing sort of a philosophical bioethics, and on the other hand, I sometimes wonder if one of bioethics vulnerabilities is that it's a field without a discipline, and that the interdisciplinarity can make it hard to have conversations with each other in ways that are not also sort of vulnerable to talking past each other and kind of and needing to sort of posture a position, and that sometimes I think there's an interesting tension there in terms of how we think about methodology and expectations, which I don't think is actually. I think all of that is also vulnerable to the things that Jonathan's been talking about citational erasure, inside or outside of philosophy. But I wonder if sometimes that tension is there.
But we're not all the same kind of philosopher is one of the things I would say. We were trained in very different, kind of traditions within philosophy to that extent. But also because that hard work is the work we need to do. I mean, that's the way forward. And it is a slow thinking, deliberative, give and take, reciprocal kind of processing, rather than a certain kind of philosophy sitting as the judge of all the other disciplines and deciding what's relevant.
Right. I wonder I invite the panelists if you have questions for each other, but if we're kind of moving toward a conclusion here, I'm almost tempted to ask you, because we've talked about a lot of different things that need to happen in the next 50 years of the field, right? If we look back at the previous ones, if you were in a position to be able to sort of modify one thing about the field that you think would have a lasting impact on, or reflect the direction it needs to go, is there something that comes to mind? If it was, you could kind of make one change, wave a wand. Might be about how the field functions. It might be about how other people receive it. Jonathan?
So, I mean, if I could change one thing about the field, right, I would reorient the ethics in bioethics, and I would subsequently reorient the bio in bioethics, right? And so let me give an example, right? We trace the history of bioethics from utilitarianism, which is, generally a very, more or less, right, as a sort of elevator pitch under articulation of the philosophical ground of the field, right? So if we tend to treat, or if we start there, right, that commits us to particular ways of thinking, resolving ethical questions, particular kinds of methodologies, right? And so what if we understood the ethics in bioethics as being grounded in feminist care ethics, for example, right? What would the considerations of the wide varieties of bioethical issues look like? What if we reconsidered the ethics in bioethics through, say, John Dewey's pragmatist ethics, where all conduct is ethical insofar as our conduct happens within a sociocultural milieu and affects individuals within that milieu. Your responsibility in a bioethical situation is not simply to yourself or to the best outcome, but to the outcomes of an entire community, right? And so what if we rethought bio as not simply referring to, say, perhaps a mechanistic understanding of the human body, but an interdependent understanding of the human body, say, phenomenological understanding of the human body, where the body extends beyond the epidermis and incorporates all elements of its environment, everything from the tools we use to the air we breathe to the shoes we wear. Bioethical issues shift from the kinds of things that are predominantly discussed in a clinical setting to things like, say, how do we decide, or actually, to quote one of my students, how do we better design bras so that women are not like sort of suffering for the sake of particular kinds of social norms, right? Why would we not think about that in terms of a bioethical issue, given the ways in which a vast number of the population has to use this particular garment? And so if I was made God emperor of bioethics, right? Those are the two things that I would do. I would reorient the field such that the bio in bioethics expanded to include nature and was not simply grounded in the body, which would give it a sort of distinct orientation from environmental ethics, I think. And the ethics in it would expand to embrace ethical traditions beyond sort of the big five in the West, right? And I think you would have a more robust field out of that.
Thanks so much, Travis.
I mean, that got me thinking, and I've thought about this for all of 90 seconds, and I'm also very bad at listening and thinking at the same time. So luckily this isn't being recorded or anything. But I think we should just get rid of the bio. I'm not sure that bioethics means anything. I think it did. And then we just kept asking, but what is this? Is this included in bioethics? And it got a little bit bigger. And now people ask me all the time, well, you're a climate change ethicist. Are you a bioethicist? I'm like, I don't know. Do I care? And now everyone wants to do AI ethics. And they're like, well, you're at the Ethics Institute at Hopkins, but you're at a bioethics institute. It's on the medical public health campus. You probably don't know anything about AI, but we're training postdocs in AI ethics. And I assume that the reason is because we train practical ethicists. We train people who have skills and tools and the ability to reason in the real world in a careful way. And so I just can't for the life of me figure out why we would demarcate some set of questions and call them special and say that it's like the thing that makes up the field that's sort of interesting. So don't get me wrong. I don't do AI ethics and I don't want to, and I can't keep up, and it terrifies me. But I think part of all of that is because if you do AI ethics instead of clinical ethics, you have a different multidisciplinary skill set. But I don't think that means you're doing a different thing in principle. I think you're doing practical ethics in really different spaces. So I think I'd just get rid of the bio because I don't think it's particularly helpful anymore. And sometimes it does some of the pernicious stuff that Jonathan was talking about.
Okay. Revolution. No more bio, just ethics.
Yeah.
Other thoughts? Anyone else want to wave a magic wand and give us a thought on, if you don't?
So I'd wave it in two directions. One, to reduce the emphasis on productivity, because I have a university administrator who at a faculty meeting said that he would like to see us increase our productivity 10% annually. Think about that a while. It's a little bit like, inflation of 4,000% or whatever. Anyway, and I would also probably, in one sense, deepen the attention to, or I would like more of us who do this practical ethics to have more deep disciplinary background and not maybe less emphasis on discipline and more on deep. And I haven't thought of bioethics as kind of a sub-discipline of philosophy in a long time because I'm so embedded in the interdisciplinarity of it. But I think we need depth of experience, and sometimes that's book learn and experience and a whole history of thinkers before us. And sometimes it's depth of experience with a chronic illness or with being a mother or so on. And I think that depth and going to depth and not professionalizing and thinking that a 2-year or a 5-year degree a bioethicist makes, with or without 400 hours of observing consultations, plus more of an emphasis on depth as a counter to incessant productivity would be the change that I would want to make. So maybe it really is a wave of a wand in one similar direction.
I would love it for you to have that wand. Takunda, were you going to jump into?
I think we're out of time, but I'll just say quickly, and I think there's a whole conversation that needs to happen about what bioethics is and what we as bioethicists ought to be doing and how we ought to be thinking about what we're doing. And I think one of the challenges, and this is coming up in a lot of what we've talked about already, is like the professionalization of bioethics, which I think brings about lots of challenges and, it has shaped a lot of where it's gone. But the one thing I'll just say overall, I'm almost inclined to say that I do think it actually needs to be a lot more philosophical in whichever direction. But I think there's some people who ought to be philosophical, but if not philosophical, at the very least, and maybe this goes along with part of what Lisa is talking about, we certainly need much more in-depth ethical training, particularly once we're doing bioethics outside of like philosophy departments. Because, as Larry was pointing out, I think the big thing here with all these issues is we need people who are trained to just be able to sit with problems and to think through them. And that takes time, that takes specialized kind of knowledge and training. But it does need to be from a lot of different voices, as Jonathan has suggested. So, yeah, I think we've all touched on it, right? But thinking about ethical life as broadly and inclusively as possible, as Travis has also said. So that would be my thing.
Larry?
No, I've waved my wand already. And in the interest of time, I suspect we should stop.
All right.
But let me just say thank you. I thought the discussion was very stimulating and enlightening. Thank you.
And I think, when I think about ethics and talk with students about this, I'll say it's really about how we exist together, right? Like that's what we're doing here. And the bio part is like we're alive and we're interacting in the world as living beings and figuring out how to be with each other in communities and as individuals and as institutions. And to me, that's the project. And one thing that's been really affirming to me in this conversation is how much I think we are aligned about the importance of community and solidarity and relational thinking and engaged, embedded in curious ethics. And so I look forward to this being an ongoing conversation with you all as we evolve the field together in conversation with others. So thank you all to our panelists. Thank you again to Pews for hosting us. Thank you for those who are watching live and those who watch the recording later. I'm sure we'd all love to hear from you if you have thoughts or feedback. So please do be in touch and it can be a conversation.